Thank you to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. This is Romania. One of the most iconic countries in Europe, and more often than not, the butt of many jokes. But that's only scratching the surface, as this country and people have so much more than meets the eye. And to uncover that, sit back, relax, hit that subscribe button, and come with me to the past. The story of Romania starts some 13.8 billion years ago, when extremely hot cosmic particles started expanding and forming new things, such as atoms, stars, galaxies. And about 40,000 years ago, the first human settlement in Romania. Throughout the early ages of human settlement in Romania, agriculture and livestock farming based settlements became commonplace, with numerous cultures springing up because of this, such as the Hamanja people, who gave us some of the best examples of surviving Neolithic art today. By the Iron Age, Greek settlers seeking to get away from their cursed lands of unpaid loans and homoerotic relations took to the seas and went to settle new lands around the Black Sea coast. Upon founding a few port cities on the coast of present-day Romania, they came into contact with a people group they called the Getae. Now, we don't exactly know where the Getae came from, nor how they got here. As far as we know, the spaghetti monster personally created them out of pasta and meatballs, but it is estimated that they were probably some sort of Thracians. What we do know, however, is that their neighbors esteemed them as expert archers and fierce warriors. So, that's something at least. Yet, today in this part of the world, the Getae are better known as the Dacians. By the first millennium BC, the Dacians became the dominating power in Romania thanks to their most notable king, Burabista, who unified the various Dacian tribes into a cohesive force eager to expand its territory. This expansion, however, knocked it right into another expansionist regime, the Roman Empire, and the Dacians and Romans became happy to see each other as much as a Mexican cartel and the DEA. As they both seek to expand their influence and empires, border skirmishes arose and steadily evolved into a more serious conflict, which later came to be known as the Dacian Wars. The first of the Dacian Wars was led by the Roman Emperor Domitian, who cockily marched the Roman army over the Danube into Dacia, thinking the war would be a piece of cake, only to be ambushed and lose 2 of his legions. Yet, that did not stop Rome from coming in again a year later. After the empire recuperated its army and marched their asses across the Danube again, the two fought multiple battles. Sometimes the Romans would win, other times not so much. Ultimately, every nerd's favorite empire proclaimed victory, and a tense peace followed, where the Dacians promised to behave themselves and pay tribute to Rome, filling their pockets with precious gold, silver, iron, and whatever the ancient European civilizations considered their equivalent of Bitcoin at the time. However, after some time, the Dacian king Decebal decided that if the Romans wanted their own money, they could get it themselves instead of mooching off from the Dacian people. And instead of sending their precious gold to Rome, it would be better off if they spent it on fortifying Dacia's own borders and defenses. Another one of Decebal's IQ 200 ideas for improving Dacia's finances and making some extra coin was to raid and pillage the border towns in the nearby Roman provinces, which absolutely in no way whatsoever could ever backfire. It backfired. By 101 AD, Dacian disobedience had gotten a little too cute, and after suffering one too many raids, Rome's new emperor, Trajan, crossed into Dacia and made his way to its capital, burning every village, field, and anything and everything resembling a Dacian. The two armies clashed fiercely, inflicting heavy losses to one another. However, nothing would be able to stop Trajan's fury. 2 Dacian wars later, despite the Dacians putting up a good fight, Dacia fell, and Decebal, alongside several of his nobles, committed suicide as Roman armies marched across their previous empire. And so, starting from 106 AD, Dacia became a Roman province. The war with Rome completely destroyed its infrastructure, and many roads, farms, bridges, and cities had to be rebuilt. And seeing as Trajan had enslaved and deported potentially up to 500,000 Dacians, Dacia needed to be repopulated as well. Thus, the residents from all over the Roman Empire were moved in to work on the previously devastated by war lands and rebuild the province from scratch. With their arrival, the new migrants in Dacia also brought their Latin language with them, effectively Romanizing Dacia and making it an indispensable Roman province. Now, after the Romans took over Dacia, you'd think there would finally be peace and prosperity, right? Fat chance, this is the history of Romania after all. Soon after Dacia's integration into Rome, raids from barbarian, Germanic, and free Dacian tribes became a regular occurrence, and the soldiers essentially had to play whack-a-mole with the amount of raids they were getting. By the late 3rd century, this ultimately became too much for the Roman army to handle, and they had no other choice but to pull out of the province. Yet, despite only being around for 150 years, the Latin language stuck around for good. And to the pleasure or dismay of many, Romania was canonized as a family member of the Latin-speaking world. However, back in the medieval ages, finding out whom you were related to wasn't the easiest task. Not because they didn't have good bookkeeping, nor the knowledge of genealogy, but because they didn't have MyHeritage, baby! MyHeritage is a worldwide leading family history service. With over 19 billion records, MyHeritage helps you discover your long-lost family in a fun and easy way. With just a couple of clicks, you can discover an entire family history you never even knew about. By building your family tree on MyHeritage, even if you don't know much about their origins, you can still find new family members and their records with little to no effort. For example, I discovered I had a great-grandaunt in Czechia, which is just wild. You've all seen my video about my DNA, but using MyHeritage's DNA test, I can get an even more accurate picture of my origins. Who would have thought I actually even have 13% Iberian in me? Also, if you happen to find any old photos of relatives, MyHeritage can repair, colorize, enhance them, or even animate them. So, don't waste any time. Click my link in the description or scan the QR code to start your 14-day free trial right now and discover your family today. For the next several hundred years, starting from the early 4th century, the territories of modern-day Romania became the hottest new destination for various groups of nomadic raiders and future would-be settlers such as the Goths, Gepids, Huns, Avars, Bulgars, and Slavs, who all either went through the region, as your typical raider does, or settled it. During this time period, modern-day Romanian territories were either under the control of the Avars or Bulgars. At the same time, early Christianity also began to spread throughout the land, as Byzantine missionaries went through the barbarian lands attempting to put them on the righteous path of believing in Jesus Christ and substituting meat for fish on Fridays. Throughout the early medieval ages, Romania as we know it today was slowly starting to form, as people from all across Europe and afar entered the country's territory and began to intermingle with the Latin-speaking populace of the previously Dacian lands. With these migrations, the Romanized language, culture, and traditions spread to all parts of the future country's territories. By the end of the 9th century, everyone's favorite group of people, the Hungarians, made it to the Carpathian Basin and steadily began to conquer Transylvania. In typical Hungarian fashion, they knew that Transylvania would be great if it wasn't for all those pesky Romanians running around acting like they owned the place. So, in the 11th century, King Groza invited Germanic peoples from what are today the Low Countries to settle in the fertile farmlands of Transylvania in exchange for protecting the easternmost frontier of the Hungarian border. Although they were tasked with protecting the kingdom, they nevertheless failed quite miserably at the one job they had when the Mongols showed up in the mid-13th century and ravaged the entirety of the Hungarian kingdom like a rabid pit bull at a children's playground. While Transylvania was succumbing to the Hungarians, Wallachia succumbed to Europe's second favorite group of people, the Bulgarians. The province spent several hundred years from the late 7th century until the late 10th century under the Bulgarian Empire, until Wallachia too became an on and off vassal state of the Hungarian crown. This vassalage lasted up until King Bessarab I thoroughly trounced the Hungarian army at the Battle of Posada in the mid-14th century. Upon mugging the Hungarians, Bessarab then modeled his new kingdom after the Byzantines, making it into a religious autocracy. After that, he then also began building a strong defensive army, just in case if the Hungarians or Bulgarians needed another lesson to be taught on who's the real Sigma male here. He also established the use of Church Slavonic in the Romanian branch of Orthodox Christianity, which forever doomed Romania in the effort of beating the being Slavic allegations. During this time, Moldova was also emerging into existence, although at first as a Hungarian vassal state meant to protect the kingdom's easternmost border. Yet, in the mid-1300s, the voivode Bogdan I defeated the army of the Hungarian king Lajos I and so secured Moldovan independence that turned it into, at this time, the second independent Romanian principality. But, as you know, this is the Balkans, and no one can really have nice things. And so, upon reaching the 1400s, an existential threat to Europe's existence emerged, the Ottoman Empire, and its seemingly inevitable march into Christian Europe. As the Turks were about to as popular as a foot rash during this era, we saw many of Romania's most historic national heroes arise in an effort to fight the Muslim invaders. As Wallachia fell to Ottoman influence in the beginning of the 1400s. Not long after, Wallachia's circumstances produced perhaps the most famous and lovable Romanian of all, Prince Vlad III, aka Vlad Țepeș, aka Vlad I make the Turks themselves into the kebabs, the Impaler. Child Vlad was kept as a hostage in the Ottoman royal courts to ensure his father Vlad II, the voivode of Wallachia, would stay loyal to the Turks. As an adult, he was sent back to Wallachia to rule in the hopes that he'd be a well-behaved little lad who would sit down, shut up, eat his kufte, and pay the Ottomans their yearly tribute. Instead, upon reaching Wallachia, Vlad invited the Turks to fist themselves with a pineapple. This, of course, didn't sit well with the Ottoman Sultan, so the Ottomans sent an incursion force into Wallachia to put down his rebellion. However, upon reaching Wallachia, Vlad made sure that the Turks wouldn't go hungry, as he created a forest of 20,000 shish kebabbed people he had impaled from a local town. While this scared the ever-living Christ out of the Ottomans, it ultimately did very little to end the Turkish domination of Wallachia. While all of this was happening in Wallachia, another great historical figure was rising in Moldova, Stefan III, aka Stefan the Great. Being flanked by the empires of the Hungarians, Ottomans, and Poles on all sides, unsurprisingly, his reign was marked by non-stop battles. The Battle of Vaslui was deemed as his crowning achievement, where he managed to defeat an Ottoman army 3 times larger than his own and gained the title of Champion of Christ from the Pope because of that. Stefan would only end up losing 2 of his 50 battles, which is even more impressive considering the madman was usually outnumbered. He's also remembered for erecting a monastery for each victory, many of which are still some of Romania's most beloved sites to visit in the country to this day. While alive, Stefan excelled at enduring Moldovan autonomy like Vlad in Wallachia, and once he died, Moldova, like Wallachia, fell under Ottoman dominion. The 3 principalities held out against the Ottomans as long as possible, but by the time the Kingdom of Hungary lost the Battle of Mohacs against the Turks in the 16th century, and with it lost Transylvania, all 3 of the principalities became vassal states of the Ottoman Empire, albeit with some degree of autonomy. However, in the beginning of the 17th century, Prince Mihai II of Wallachia managed, through both adept political maneuvering and decisive battle victories, to unite the 3 principalities under his rule, although it was only for under a year until he was taken down by the Turks and Habsburgs. Nevertheless, A for effort. However short-lived, this unification was pivotal to the Romanian identity. From now on, whichever principality you lived in, the Romanian dream of unification was ignited in its people's hearts. Unlike in other parts of the Balkans, Ottoman influence in Transylvania was rather short-lived. After the Ottomans did one too many invasions into Europe and suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Vienna, Austria was able to recover much of its lost Hungarian lands and integrate them under its own crown. From this point on, the culture of the Romanians in Transylvania took a decisive Austro-Hungarian turn, while Wallachia and Moldova, still under Turkish control, went a different path. As time went on, the Ottomans decided they couldn't really be bothered to properly govern Wallachia and Moldavia. I mean, would you? Have you seen Craiova and Vaslui? I rest my case, Your Honor. So, By the late 17th century, they sent the Phanriots, Orthodox Greeks from Constantinople, to have someone rule in their place who they could trust as their voivodes of Moldavia and Wallachia. The idea with this governance was that the Orthodox locals would respond better to taking orders from rulers who were Orthodox themselves, rather than from some guy in Istanbul who wears an onion for a hat and has meat made out of pork as his kryptonite. While this added some Greek influence to Romanian culture, the Phanriots nevertheless were pretty uniformly despised for their corruption and exploitation of the local populations. During one of the numerous Russo-Turkish wars in the 1700s, when Russian forces marched into the Ottoman territories of Wallachia and Moldavia, the Romanians initially were relieved that someone powerful was finally coming to rescue them from those bothersome Greeks. This particular installation of the Russo-Turkic Wars dragged on until the early 1800s, until the Russian victory led to the Peace Treaty of Bucharest, ending the conflict. As thanks for all their hard work of stomping the Turks, Moscow demanded the annexation of the entirety of Wallachia and Moldova, although they ended up only being granted the eastern half of Moldova, which later became known as Bessarabia. Soon after, the Russians established both Moldova and Wallachia as protectorates, despite the fact that the areas were still technically under Ottoman domain. At first, this change in governance was widely welcomed by the Romanians because, hey, how bad could rule under the Russians be? Am I right? Well, it was bad. Shockingly, the Russians ended up being more corrupt and oppressive than their predecessors, and public discontent with their new overlords quickly started to grow. By the mid-1800s, Romanians in each principality faced increasingly subjugated existences under either Russian, Ottoman, or Hungarian rule, and so educated Romanians were sending their children to study in the West. Naturally, being Romanian, their instinct was to get the hell out of Romania as quickly as possible, with France being the #1 choice of destination. These children then later on came back eager to share their brand new Western revolutionary ideas regarding independence, nationalism, and a unified cultural identity. And so, inspired by various European revolutions making the waves around the mid-1800s, in particular in France, the Romanians, fed up with being pushed around by Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and the Russians, initiated revolutions in each principality to liberate Wallachia, Moldova, and Transylvania, and to achieve unification. The Turks, Russians, and Hungarians proceeded to react exactly to these uprisings as you'd expect, and each revolution was brutally put down almost immediately. However, despite the brutal suppression of the people, the romantic ideas of nationalism and unification truly took a firm hold in the public imagination, and from now on, the Romanian identity was synonymous with the unification of its three principalities. Throughout the same time period, the Russians and Turks yet again went to war for the millionth time, with Russia finally withdrawing its troops from Romania after France and Great Britain threatened to declare war on it if it didn't leave the country. With Russia's defeat, Romania took advantage of the opportunity to petition its ally France to support its unification. The Paris Congress decided to allow for the creation of the United Principalities of Moldova and Wallachia. However, the two would have separate governments, separate rulers, and separate legislative bodies, which, what the f did that even mean? You can be united, but you have to be separate. Bro, like, just say no in that case, god damn. In response, Wallachia and Moldova simply elected the same man as the ruling prince of both countries, Alexandru Ioan Cuza. And presto, France was given the middle finger back, and the Romanian United Principalities were created. A minor unification, if you will, and still technically under the Ottoman domain, but a unification nonetheless. Luckily, in the late 1800s, during yet again another Russo-Turkish war, the Turks got fully pushed back to Constantinople and were pushed out of Romania for good. In response, Romania promptly declared its independence, and finally the great powers officially recognized the Moldovan-Wallachian Union as the independent state of Romania. And so, in May 1881, at the coronation of King Harold I, the Kingdom of Romania was born. Romania now had Wallachia, Moldova, and Dobruja, finally united, and so began a stable period of modernization and economic growth. However, soon enough, World War I came knocking. Like much of Europe's royalty during the time, Romania's King Carol was of inbred German stock. Apparently, he had signed a secret treaty of alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary back in 1883, which the political elites who wanted to ally with the Entente, along with their forever BFF France, were absolutely thrilled to discover. As a compromise, they decided to try neutrality. Ultimately, France promised that if Romania allied with them, it would be fully united with Transylvania, Bukovina, and Bessarabia. And so, Romania entered the war on the side of the Entente, only for it to be overcome by the Central Powers and being forced to surrender massive chunks of territory to the likes of Hungary and Bulgaria. Luckily, they were able to re-enter the war on the Entente side literally one day before Germany surrendered. And so, with such cheese tactics, Romania emerged on the winning side and got to share in the spoils of victory. That's right! Carving up Hungary, baby! And you get a piece of Hungary! And you get a piece of Hungary! Everyone gets a piece of Hungary! And alongside getting back everything it lost previously due to its brainiac move of attacking a far larger enemy, the country also got much more. By the end of the First World War, the victors decided to give Austria-Hungary, who they saw as responsible for starting this whole pointless war in the first place, a spanking of a lifetime, via treaty after another treaty after, you guessed it, a treaty? Well, some of the post-war treaties are a bit controversial to say the least. Romania managed to emerge a clear winner. From now former Hungarian territory, it gained Transylvania, as well as some of Banat, Crișana, Maramureș, northern Bukovina, and it reclaimed Bessarabia, all of which effectively doubled its size and greatly increased its population. And so, on December 1st, 1918, Romania achieved full unification and Greater Romania was born. Finally, a centuries-long dream of the possibility of a distinct, cohesive, and united cultural identity without the forced influence of a foreign power would now be within the people's grasp, and the people rejoiced. However, as great as it was for the Romanian cultural identity, the political situation wasn't so stable, with this time period being marked by ethnic conflicts, constant changes in the government, and the rise of fascist and authoritarian movements. In the decade between 1930 and 1940 alone, Romania experienced 25 different governments, with the recently launched Iron Guard, Romania's most prominent fascist party, contributing heavily to this instability. The Iron Guard, also known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael, was virulently anti-capitalist, anti-communist, anti-democratic, and anti-Western ideals, specifically those annoying parts about human rights. They presented themselves to the people as a pious Orthodox peasant championing alternative to the out-of-touch corrupt elites and capitalized on Romania's at the time rabid anti-Semitism to recruit by promising to take care of all those job-stealing Jews. They had no qualms whatsoever about utilizing political assassinations, bombings, and other acts of terrorism against the state to get their way, and made no secret of their aim to ally themselves with Nazi Germany as soon as possible. Throughout the 30s, tensions and instability continued to grow, and once Romania learned of the existence of the secret Nazi-Soviet Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to carve up Eastern Europe between themselves, they knew perfectly well what was going to happen to them. The best case scenario was that only Bessarabia would be taken by the Soviets. And so of course, they proceeded to enter full-on panic mode. While Romania wanted to remain loyal to France, its longtime protector and benefactor, due to being surrounded by Nazis on one side and the Soviet Union on the other, King Carol II decided to remain neutral and hope for the best. This worked just as great as it did in World War I, and once again, big chunks of its territory were quickly occupied by the likes of Hungary, the Soviet Union, and Bulgaria. The public outrage over the loss of territory, specifically Transylvania, to Hungary, led to Carol's abdication and exile in September of 1940, and his young son, Mihai, was crowned in his place. However, during this time, the real power in Romania actually belonged to General Ion Antonescu, who had been appointed with dictatorial powers by King Carol II, in hopes he would rule with the Iron Guard and secure some popular support. Instead, Antonescu crushed the Iron Guard and seized total power with Adolf Hitler's approval. Once secure in his position of absolute power, he then proceeded to go on such a killing spree against Jews, gypsies, foreigners, dissidents, and political enemies that even the Nazis looked over at what he was doing and told him that he should probably turn it down a bit and maybe, just maybe, try being a little less cruel. Similarly to one other country in the Balkans. Antonescu, by now absolute dictator, officially brought Romania into the war on the Axis' side in 1940 and proceeded to provide equipment, oil, and massive amounts of troops to the Eastern Front. Romania then proceeded to get decimated by the Allied bombings, incapacitate its valuable oil fields, as well as by the land invasions conducted by the Soviets. While fighting on the Eastern Front, they lost more than 200,000 men. Rather than coming to aid its ally, Hitler instead focused on exporting as much fuel and food out of Romania as possible to feed and fuel his armies, leaving Romania to lay in a state of chaotic limbo until August 1944, when King Mihai decided to change his country's trajectory by force. By this time, the upcoming Soviet conquest of Romania was just a matter of time, as they were already at Iași's door. The common knowledge was that Germany would lose. Romania was being destroyed and its people being slaughtered. Throughout the war, the now 22-year-old King Mihai had been forced to sit on the sidelines as a mindless figurehead, sitting there like a Ken doll for ceremonial purposes, while Antonescu's government actually led the country. However, Mihai had been meeting secretly with the many secret pro-Allied politicians, army officers, security officials, and other elites. So, in August 1944, Mihai called Antonescu in for a private meeting and informed him that from here on, Romania would join the Allies and withdraw all troops from the Axis alliance. Or else. General Antonescu refused, and so in marched Mihai's loyalist troops to arrest him, while the rest of his loyal security and military apparatus quickly and successfully enacted a full-on coup. King Mihai then proceeded to give a radio broadcast in which he announced Romania's alliance with the Allied powers. To do that, he had to sign an armistice of unconditional surrender to the USSR, whose terms were almost unilaterally dictated by the Soviet Union only. From then on, Romania was a part of the Allied powers, and even joined in with the Soviet army in April 1945 as they marched towards Germany to secure the Allied victory. Ultimately, Romania emerged in the winning team, just as it did in World War I, by again utilizing nothing else but cheese tactics. Unfortunately, the whole letting the USSR dictate the terms of the armistice meant that from now on, they were to be occupied by the Soviet Union as a form of protection, and from that point on, the Soviets were in charge of absolutely everything. In the hopes of attracting Western sympathy for what he knew Romania's fate under a Soviet occupation would be, King Mihai appointed a pro-Western government. The Soviets installed Petru Groza as prime minister, basically so they'd have someone to look the other way as they committed full-scale looting of the state. Alongside this, the Soviet Union awarded itself with the full annexation of Bessarabia, attaching it to their previously annexed territory of Transnistria and forming the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. And it's not an exaggeration to say that this was one of the biggest sources of historical trauma for Romania, as it was powerless to stop Moscow from essentially kidnapping millions of its citizens and constructing an artificial non-Romanian identity for Moldova, a territory that was an essential pillar in the construction of the Romanian cultural and historical identity. Almost immediately upon the installation of the pro-Soviet government, King Mihai refused to sign or support any other decrees, effectively going on strike. Groza's response was to exile the king and abolish the monarchy completely. And so, Romania stepped into its socialist era. A few years later, after Groza seized power, he was replaced by Gheorghe Gheorghe, who, in contrast, wasn't a hardline Stalinist and focused on gradually distancing Bucharest from Moscow's orbit. He even opened up Romania to a bit of Western development and economic aid. Yet, by the mid-60s, Dej kicked the bucket, possibly from polonium poisoning in his tea, or maybe even from the chunk of Romanian mined radioactive refined uranium he kept on his desk as a paperweight. I prefer to think its cause was the uranium, because that's absolutely hilarious. However, what's not hilarious was his successor, who was none other than Nikolai Ceausescu. Believe it or not, at first, Ceausescu was actually quite well liked. It helped that he built upon Gheorghe Udej's policies of relative independence from the Soviet Union, even being the only Warsaw Pact country who refused to participate in the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, even publicly condemning it. Nevertheless, after Ceausescu came into office for some time, Romania's economy boomed, which led the West to hopefully assume that Ceausescu's leadership would be more akin to Joseph Tito's Yugoslavia, more third way in nature and less of a batshit insane UC Berkeley Marxist club way. But after Mr. Nikolai visited China and North Korea in the early 70s, he came back with some ideas for his country straight out of his citizens' wildest nightmares. First of all, from now on, there will be out with the old, in with the new, meaning countless traditional and historic neighborhoods and even entire towns were destroyed to construct great commie blocks as far as the eye could see. Tens of thousands of people were forcibly displaced, while any sort of localized control over anything was abolished, and anything with any sort of chain of command was centralized to Bucharest. Because with a country this size that needs 10 hours by train to reach one big city from the other, who needs a decentralized nation? Ceausescu's trip instilled in him the need for a dramatic increase in Romania's population, so he initiated Decree 770, an absolute draconian law on family planning to ensure the maximum number of children from each woman as possible. Abortion was outlawed, monthly gynecological checks were mandatory, birth control was illegal, and childless couples had to pay an additional monthly tax of at least 10% of their incomes. As a result, this generation was by far the largest in Romanian history, and colloquially was named Decreței. And unfortunately, a great deal of these children were born to families who had almost no way to care for them, which subsequently forced thousands of kids to live as orphans on the streets and sewers, or in rundown, understaffed, underfinanced orphanages where abuse and mistreatment was more than just common. Ceausescu's trip to China and North Korea also got him thinking about how he could most properly get the love and attention he deserved. So he made for himself the most creepy and pervasive personality cult possible, in which he was the genius of the Carpathians, an all-loving, infallible father, and the population of Romania were his children. His wife, Elena, was also truly a feminist icon, near illiterate yet somehow obtained a PhD in chemistry, and she was a loving mother of the nation, yet still a working woman and brilliant scientist. Barbie had nothing on her. And unless you wanted to be thrown into custody of the Securitatea and disappear like tens of potentially hundreds of thousands of others, you toe these lines, or else. Shockingly, with policies like these, it turned out the genius of the Carpathians actually knew nothing about running anything, and anyone who knew better and spoke out got a bullet to the head. And so Nikolai and Elena Ceausescu single-handedly reshaped Romania from the ground up. Bucharest today is almost unrecognizable compared to 100 years ago, as a massive earthquake struck it in 1977 and gave the Ceausescus the golden opportunity to demolish half the city to construct the communist dystopia we know today. While on paper Romania's economy was technically growing, its living standards still remained the lowest in Europe, save maybe Albania. Due to the earlier good behavior in the eyes of the West, Ceausescu had racked up debts with the IMF worth $13 billion by the late 70s. Thus, in the early 1980s, Ceausescu decided it was time to reorganize Romania's economy with the single purpose of paying off its debts. From now on, anything and everything of value and use would be sold off for foreign hard currency used to pay off the debt. Domestically, oil, gas, and food were severely rationed and prices of daily necessities skyrocketed. In just a few years, the standard of living, which was already not great, fell by 40%. And there were massive cuts to every program of government spending. Although these cuts didn't affect the Vandy construction project of insanity in Bucharest, the People's Palace. Ceausescu knew that Romania at the time, one of the poorest countries in Europe, needed the biggest, heaviest building in the world to be the seat of its government. Thousands of volunteers likely died while constructing this socialist dystopian eyesore that has over 1,000 rooms, 20 kilometers of secret tunnels, 18 stories, 9 above ground and 9 below. While Romania's people were starving, having been put on low-calorie diets so more food could be exported, the Ceausescus decided to allocate 2 billion euros to the construction and sourcing of quality materials such as white marble, crystal, and luxurious textiles. Anyone who suggested even mildly that perhaps some of this money could be used to feed, clothe, or heat the starving populace could be either shot dead on the street, as an example, or disappeared without a word to their family. Credit where credit is due, technically, the plan worked, and Romania paid off its debts by the end of the 80s. But shockingly, the Romanian population was getting pretty darn mad. By this time, protests were already starting to spring up here and there, and had to be subdued by the Securitatea, Romania's secret police. However, this only continued to fuel the fire. In 1989, riots began when in Timișoara, the Securitatea tried to arrest a popular Hungarian priest who openly opposed the demolition of churches and forced deportation of villagers into more urban areas. Instead of giving him up, massive crowds formed alongside his residence, blocking the police from entering. Initially, this protest was simply over a single issue. However, after decades of cruel mistreatment, more and more people started to join in, and the protest quickly became against the government itself. Soon, crowds began to riot, and the army was called in and then proceeded to massacre hundreds of civilians. In a desperate PR stunt, Nikolai organized a mass rally thinking it would garner him support, but instead, the crowd heckled and jeered him.
Acestei mari manifestări populare din București, considerând aceasta ca o
which then sparked the police and military to attack the rally attendees as well. Within a matter of days, civilians all over the country rose up against the regime, and even the army switched sides. The Ceausescus tried to flee, but were subsequently arrested and immediately put on trial for crimes against humanity, where they were found guilty and were executed live on television on Christmas Day 1989. After the Ceausescus were dealt with, Romania decided to embrace capitalism. Like any post-Soviet state, the 90s were a very rocky transition period for Romania, and it struggled to find its footing when immediately transitioning from a centralized and pre-planned economy to the free market. Unsurprisingly, corruption and inefficiency plagued its economic prospects, and unfortunately, it was quite a bumpy ride, with its politics often more resembling playground fights than true political discourse. The country wasn't really able to truly start shaking away its past ghosts of communism until it started to fully integrate within the EU, first by joining NATO in 2004 and then by joining the EU proper in 2007. However, since joining the EU, it's safe to say that Romania is one of Europe's major success stories, as its dramatic and consistent economic progress can attest. Its quality of life, income level, and expected life expectancy have all risen meteorically, thanks to Romanians quite literally taking back their country by force. And although things aren't perfect in Romania, the future is still looking much brighter for the country and its peoples. Although often very overlooked or even used as a punchline, Romania is truly a country with a rich and fascinating history, wonderful and resilient people, and it deserves far more visitors than it gets. Hopefully now that we've been over its thousands of years of history, you'll be perhaps just a bit more curious about this place, and maybe I'll see you here sometimes. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click that subscribe button, or even become a member like these wonderful people. And don't forget to go and check out my heritage and find out a little bit more about your own family history. My name is Janos, and you've watched Living Around a Clean Europe.
Hey, why are you